The wind did not knock. It pressed against the logs of Sarah Hendrick's cabin like a living thing trying to get inside. Snow slid sideways across the Bitterroot Valley, scratching against the windows. The chimney gave a low groan. Frost crept along the edges of the floorboards, and yet inside that small cabin on Elk Creek, 2 children slept without blankets piled to their chins. That was the first thing Bill Calhoun noticed. He stood outside in the dark of early January 1888, boots buried to the ankle in drifting snow, staring at Sarah's chimney. The smoke was thin, too thin. His own chimney roared like a freight train. He had fed it half his woodpile in 4 days. Sarah's barely whispered. If you have ever watched another man's fire burn lower than yours in a storm like that, you know the question that follows. How? Inside, Sarah knelt beside her stove, not stuffing it full, not panicking. She placed 2 split pieces of lodgepole pine into the cast iron belly and closed the door gently. The flame caught slow and steady. Behind her, Emma rolled onto her side in bed. Daniel's hand dangled over the edge of the mattress. Their breathing stayed deep and even. No coughing tonight, no stiff fingers tucked under armpits. Sarah rose and walked barefoot across the floor. She paused, placed her palm flat against the boards. Warm, not stove warm, not fire hot, but steady. She closed her eyes just for a second, feeling the grain beneath her skin. Outside, the wind climbed higher. The temperature had fallen all afternoon. By sundown, it was already below 0. By midnight, it would drop further. Cabins 3 miles down the valley were already losing ground. Earlier that week, Sarah had heard the talk at the Stevensville store. She's digging under her own house. Going to sink the whole thing. Moisture will rot it from below. Horace Finch had leaned across the counter when she bought nails in November. You undermine a foundation, he had said, tapping the wood with his knuckle, and the ground takes it back. Sarah had nodded politely. She did not explain. Now, as the wind tightened its grip on the valley, she crossed the room and pushed the bed aside. She lifted the wool rug. She opened the trap door. A breath of rising warmth met her face. Not a gust, not a blast, just a quiet exhale from below. The chamber beneath the cabin held the heat the stove had fed it all week. Stone walls, packed earth. A space carved 4 feet below the frost line. It did not fight the cold. It outlasted it. Sarah lowered herself through the opening, boots landing on sand spread across the chamber floor. The air down here felt different. Still, thick with stored warmth. She placed her hand against the stacked creek stone. The rock gave back what it had taken. Above her, the stove sent another slow ribbon of heated air through the tin duct angled downward from the floor. A simple path. Warm air drifting down. Cool air circling back up. A loop that did not hurry. A loop that did not waste. She climbed back up and closed the trap door. Moved the bed into place. The cabin looked ordinary again. That was the beauty of it. Across the valley that same night, Bill Calhoun's youngest boy began to cry. His wife wrapped him in 2 quilts. Bill fed another armload into the stove. The flames leapt high. The ceiling beams grew hot. The floor stayed cold. By morning, frost had formed along the nailheads near their doorway. Sarah rose before dawn. She did not rush to the stove. She poured water into a tin cup and watched her breath drift in the faint light. There was breath, yes, but it did not hang thick in the air. She walked to the corner farthest from the stove, knelt, placed her palm against the boards again. Still warm. The storm had only begun, and the valley had no idea what was waiting beneath her floor. By the 3rd day, the valley sounded different, not louder, quieter. Snow had buried the fences. The sky hung low and white. Chimneys no longer roared. They gasped. Bill Calhoun stood inside his cabin with his gloves still on. His stove door glowed red. Pine cracked and popped. Sparks climbed the flue. His wife held their youngest close to the iron belly, careful not to touch it. The room felt warm near the stove. 3 steps away, the boards felt like stone. Bill knelt and pressed his hand flat against the floor. He pulled it back fast. Cold. He looked at the woodpile through the window. Half of it gone. It had only been 3 days. Across the valley, Eugene Cross dragged a broken chair toward his stove. He hesitated, ran his hand across the carved backrest, then shoved it in. The fire swallowed it. He stood there watching the flames, jaw tight, breath thin. Mary Watts fed damp logs into her stove and wiped her eyes from the smoke. Her kettle never quite boiled. And still, Sarah Hendrick's chimney breathed in a thin gray ribbon. On the 5th day, the wind sharpened. Snow slipped under doors. Ice crept along window frames. The temperature held at 20 below. Inside Sarah's cabin, Emma sat cross-legged on the floor with a small slate board in her lap. Daniel stacked wooden blocks and knocked them over again. Sarah stitched a torn mitten by the stove. The fire burned low. Not starving, not roaring, just steady. She rose, crossed the room, and knelt near the far wall. Not near the stove, near the corner most cabins dreaded. She pressed her palm to the floor. The boards felt alive under her skin. She stood and lifted the kettle from the stove. Walked to the table without rushing. Poured hot water into 3 cups. Steam rose gently. Outside, Bill Calhoun squinted toward her cabin through the white blur. He had gone through nearly a full cord. His chimney spat sparks into the storm. He could not understand how her smoke stayed thin. On the 7th day, the wind shifted north. Harder. Colder. Eugene Cross pounded ice from the inside of his door with the butt of his rifle. He wrapped his hands in strips of cloth. His breath hung heavy in the room. He muttered to himself, then broke apart the small table beside his bed. Wood splintered in his grip. At Sarah's place, the stove door opened once every few hours. 2 logs, sometimes 3. Nothing more. That night she pulled the bed aside again, lifted the trap door. A wave of steady warmth rose to meet her. She lowered herself into the chamber with a lantern. The stone walls gave off stored heat. Not sharp, not blazing, just constant. She crouched and placed both hands against the rock. It answered. Above her, the duct carried another slow spill of warm air down into the chamber. The earth beyond the stone stayed firm and dry. No seepage, no damp smell, just soil that refused to freeze at that depth. She climbed back up and sealed the door. Emma stirred in her sleep. Daniel turned over and pressed his cheek against the mattress. No one shivered. Midway through that storm, Sarah paused at the window and looked out across the valley. The land was erased. Fences gone. Roads gone. Only the tops of chimneys and the faint shape of barns breaking the white. This was not a winter you endured with pride. This was a winter that counted what you had prepared. If you have ever faced a season that tests every choice you made months earlier, you know how quiet those nights can feel. On the 10th day, Bill Calhoun stepped outside at dawn. His woodpile stood nearly empty. He stared at Sarah's chimney again, still that thin ribbon. He wiped frost from his mustache and made a decision. The storm had not broken, but he was going to find out what she had done. On the 11th morning, the wind stopped, not slowly, all at once. The valley stood still under a sky the color of iron. Snowdrifts rose like frozen waves against cabin walls. Chimneys poked through white mounds. Doors had to be forced open with shoulders and boots. Bill Calhoun wrapped a scarf around his face and stepped into the silence. Each step toward Sarah's cabin sank deep. His boots made a hollow crunch. He expected to see frost lining her windows, expected to hear coughing, expected stillness. He knocked once. The door opened right away. Sarah stood there in a plain wool dress, sleeves rolled to her wrists. No coat, no shawl pulled tight around her throat. Behind her, Emma laughed at something Daniel had done with the wooden blocks on the floor. The sound stopped Bill in his tracks. He stepped inside. The air did not bite his nose. His breath did not fog thick in front of him. He removed his gloves slowly. The stove in the corner held a small, steady flame. Nothing fierce. Nothing desperate. Bill walked to the far wall. He crouched and pressed his palm to the boards. He kept it there. The floor answered with warmth. Not fire heat, but something deeper. Something stored. "What did you do?" he asked quietly. Sarah looked at him for a moment. Then she moved the bed, rolled back the rug, lifted the trap door. Bill leaned forward and stared down into the chamber below. Stone walls stacked tight against earth, sand leveled smooth at the base. A faint glow from the lantern she lowered into the space. Warm air rose slow and steady from below, brushing his face. He removed his hat, knelt, lowered one hand toward the stone. It felt like touching a sun-warmed rock in late autumn. He swallowed once. "How much wood?" he asked. "Half a cord," Sarah replied. Bill stared down again. Half a cord. He had burned nearly 2. His chimney had roared day and night, and still his children had slept in wool coats. He climbed back to his feet, ran a hand through his beard. Outside, Eugene Cross appeared at the doorway, hat pulled low. "Is it true?" he asked from the threshold. Mary Watts followed behind him, boots heavy with packed snow. Word traveled fast in a valley like that. Sarah stepped aside without ceremony. One by one they entered. They pressed their hands to the floor, moved toward the corner, felt the warmth away from the stove. No one spoke for a long moment, not because they did not have words. Because they were measuring. Calculating, Cross finally crouched by the trap door. "You dug under your own house," he said. Sarah nodded once. 4.5 feet, she answered, below the frost line. Bill stepped closer to the chamber again. "How'd you keep it dry?" "Sand. Drainage slope. Stone against the earth." "And the air?" "A duct from the stove. One vent back up." She did not lecture. She did not defend. She answered what they asked. Outside, the snow reflected sunlight so bright it forced their eyes narrow. Inside, the warmth held steady. Bill stood and looked around the cabin again. Not at the stove, at the floor, at the quiet steadiness of it. He nodded once. "I'm digging," he said. Cross let out a short breath through his nose. "Me too." Mary pressed her gloved hands together and looked down at the trap door again. "I'll need help," she said softly. Sarah closed the door to the chamber, slid the bed back into place, smoothed the rug flat. From the outside, the cabin looked like every other cabin in the Bitterroot Valley. Smoke drifting light into the clear winter air. Snow banked high against the north wall, nothing unusual. But beneath those boards lay stone that had outlasted the storm, and across the valley, men who once laughed now walked home through waist-deep snow, already counting how much earth they would have to move before the next freeze. Inside her cabin, Emma picked up a block and set it carefully on top of another. Daniel steadied the stack with both hands. The stove ticked quietly in the corner. And the floor held.